Funny how fast $63,500 becomes important when nobody can get to their own front door. The first thing you notice is the sound. Engines idling. Dozens of them. Low, impatient hums vibrating through the morning air like something alive. Then the horns start. Short bursts at first. Then longer. Frustrated. Confused. I could smell the lake before I even stepped out of my truck. Wet wood, algae. That faint metallic tang you only get when the shoreline's been churned up overnight. The sun was already climbing, reflecting off windshields lined up bumper to bumper along County Road 18. A parade of SUVs and rental jeeps stretching nearly a quarter-mile. Families stepping out, shielding their eyes, looking toward the gate like it might magically open if they stared hard enough. Didn't, because I locked it. Solid steel, 8 feet high, freshly set posts sunk deep into ground I knew better than anyone alive. My ground. I leaned against the driver's side door, coffee still warm in my hand, watching the confusion ripple through them. Someone tried the keypad. Beep. Red light. Again. Beep. Red light. A man in a polo walked up, rattled the chain, like that was going to change anything. The metallic clank echoed across the water, sharp and final. That sound right there. That was the same sound that had been sitting in the back of my head for 3 weeks. Ever since the email. Ever since Diane Whitmore decided my work wasn't worth paying for. I spotted her before she spotted me. White SUV, of course. Parked sideways like she owned the road itself. She stepped out slow, sunglasses on, phone already in her hand, posture tight like she was trying to keep control of something that had already slipped. You could always tell with Diane. Everything about her was polished, hair, voice, those perfectly chosen words she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while cutting you off at the knees. HOA president for Willow Ridge Lakes. The kind of woman who said community standards like it was law. The kind who smiled while she handed you a problem and expected you to thank her for it. She walked straight toward the gate, heels clicking against gravel, not even looking at the line of homeowners gathering behind her. They were starting to figure it out now. Something was wrong. Something wasn't working the way it always had. I took a slow sip of coffee and let them catch up. That's the thing about access. Nobody thinks about it until it's gone. The lake sat just beyond that gate, calm and glassy like nothing had changed. 47 private lake houses spread along the shoreline, each one worth $500,000 easy, some pushing closer to 7. Weekend rentals booked solid months in advance. Boats tied up at docks I rebuilt with my own hands. Retaining walls I reinforced after last spring's storms chewed through half the shoreline. You could still see the newer timber if you looked close, clean lines against older weathered boards. That was $63,500 worth of work. Materials. Labor. Nights that ran past midnight with floodlights humming and mosquitoes thick enough to taste. I didn't rush that job. I did it right, because that's what I do. Or at least, what I used to do for people who understood the difference. Diane reached the keypad and punched in the code like muscle memory would save her. Beep. Red light. She froze for half a second. Just a flicker. Then she tried again, slower this time. Beep. Red light. That's when she turned. Finally scanned the road. Saw the line of cars. The guests. The owners. The problem. And then she saw me. Standing there. Calm. Not moving. Not saying a word. Her expression shifted just slightly, but I caught it. That moment where confidence cracks and something sharper slips through. She started walking toward me. Faster now. That controlled tone already forming on her lips before she even spoke. I could hear the questions building behind her from the crowd. What's going on? Why won't it open? We have reservations. My kids are in the car. Boats booked. Check-ins scheduled. Money on the line. Always money on the line. Funny how that works. I set my coffee down on the hood and pushed off the truck just as she reached me. The morning heat already settling in. The smell of the lake drifting between us. She opened her mouth, ready to take control like she always did. But this time, I got there first. Gates closed, I said. Simple as that, voice steady. I let the silence hang just long enough for it to sink in. Then I added, until that bill gets paid, nobody's getting through. She stopped about 10 feet from me, just close enough that I could see the tension in her jaw even behind those oversized sunglasses. The crowd behind her kept growing, voices layering over each other, confusion turning into irritation, irritation edging toward panic. A kid somewhere started crying. Someone else slammed a car door harder than necessary. The sound echoed off the water like a warning shot. Diane did not raise her voice. She never did. That was part of her whole thing. Calm tone, controlled posture, like she was always the smartest person in the conversation. "Ethan," she said, drawing my name out just enough to remind me she thought we were still on equal footing. "What exactly do you think you were doing?" I glanced past her toward the lake, the morning light catching the edges of the docks I rebuilt. Clean lines, reinforced beams, every bolt tightened by hand. You could still see where the storm surge had ripped the old structure apart a month ago. I remembered that night clearly. Wind screaming across the water, rain hitting sideways so hard it felt like gravel against your skin. The shoreline had taken a beating. Retaining walls collapsed in sections, docks splintered, walkways twisted out of alignment like broken ribs. By sunrise, half the properties down there were one bad step away from liability nightmares. That was when Diane called me. Not email, not some official HOA notice. A direct call, voice tight, urgent. For once, she did not sound like she was in control. "We need you," she said. Immediately. I showed up within the hour. Boots still damp from the drive over, tool trailer rattling behind my truck. The air that morning smelled like soaked wood and diesel from generators running along the shoreline. Homeowners stood around in clusters, arms crossed, staring at the damage like they expected it to fix itself. Diane met me near the main dock, clipboard already in hand, already talking numbers, timelines, expectations. She told me to prioritize access, safety, structural integrity. Her exact words. I remember because I wrote them down later. I always write things down. "Get it functional before the weekend," she said. "People are coming in." I asked about approval, budget, formal authorization. She waved it off with that same practice smile. "We will handle the paperwork after. Just get it done." So I did. 3 weeks of work packed into 6 days. Sunrise to well past dark. Floodlights humming, generators vibrating through the boards under my boots. The smell of hot metal from cutting brackets, fresh lumber stacked along the shoreline, the constant slap of water against newly set posts. I brought in 2 extra crews, paid overtime out of my own pocket to keep things moving. Because that is what you do when someone calls you in an emergency. You solve the problem first. You trust the system to handle the rest. That was my first mistake. Diane took a step closer. Lowering her voice like this was still a private conversation. "You cannot just block access to private property. This is not how any of this works." I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but close. "Funny," I said, "because that is exactly how it worked when you decided not to pay me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. There it was. The shift. The moment where she stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and started treating it like a challenge. "We reviewed your invoice," she said, tone sharper now, more formal. "The work you performed was not properly approved under HOA guidelines. There were no signed contracts, no board vote, no." I held up a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop the list before it got any longer. "You called me," I said. "You told me to fix it. You told me to prioritize access. You told me people were coming." I gestured toward the line of cars stretching down the road, engines still idling, heat starting to shimmer off the pavement. "Well, they are here." A murmur rolled through the crowd behind her. People were listening now. Really listening. That is another thing about control. It works great until it does not. Diane turned slightly, aware of the eyes on her, then back to me. "We can resolve this through the proper channels," she said, trying to pull it back into her world, her rules. "You do not need to create a scene." I looked at the gate, the chain pulled tight, the lock sitting heavy against the steel. The same steel posts I had set myself 2 days ago. Measured, leveled, anchored deep into soil that had not been disturbed in decades. "This is not a scene," I said quietly. "This is leverage." I could feel the heat building now, not just from the sun but from the situation settling into place exactly the way I had planned it. Every detail, every step, every document I dug up after that email hit my inbox. Because when Diane sent that refusal, she thought it ended the conversation. What she did not realize was that it was just the part where I stopped talking and started digging. I did not answer her right away because I wanted that silence to do the work for me, the kind of silence that makes people start connecting dots on their own. The crowd behind her was no longer just confused. They were watching, listening, realizing this was not some random malfunction. This was deliberate. I reached into the truck and pulled out a folded set of papers, edges worn from being handled too many times over the past 48 hours. The faint smell of old ink and courthouse dust still clinging to them. "You remember the email," I said, keeping my voice level, steady enough that it carried without needing to raise it. "The one where you said the work was not approved." Diane did not respond, but her posture tightened just a fraction, shoulders pulling back like she was bracing for something she did not want to hear. I unfolded the top sheet slowly, letting the motion draw attention, letting every set of eyes in that line of stranded homeowners follow it. "That was the part where I stopped assuming you were going to do the right thing," I continued, "and started checking what I actually had." I tapped the paper lightly with my finger. A simple gesture, but it echoed louder than any of the car horns still cutting through the morning air. "Turns out what you have down there," I nodded toward the lake, "is not as secure as you think." Diane took a step closer, lowering her voice again. But there was an edge now, something sharper, less controlled. "Ethan, whatever you think you found, this is not the place to discuss it." I shook my head slightly. "No, this is exactly the place." I turned the paper so she could see it, but I angled it just enough that the people behind her could catch pieces of it too. Old survey lines, boundary markings, legal descriptions that most people would glance at and ignore, but not me. Not after that email. "This access road," I said, pointing to the thin line that ran from the county road straight down to the lake. "The one everybody here uses to get to those houses. It is not part of your HOA. A ripple moved through the crowd. You could feel it like a shift in pressure before a storm. Diane's expression did not change much, but her lips pressed tighter, the corners of her mouth losing that practiced neutrality. "That is incorrect," she said quickly, too quickly. "That road has always been community access." I nodded once like I expected that answer. "That is what everyone assumed," I said, "including me." I let that sit for a second, then added, "until I pulled the original deed records." The memory of that afternoon hit me hard for a second. The courthouse smelled like old paper and floor cleaner, quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I had sat at a worn wooden table flipping through records that had not been touched in years, dust catching in the back of my throat, eyes burning from reading line after line of legal language most people would never bother with. But I kept going, because something about that email did not sit right. And when something does not sit right, you do not ignore it. You dig. "The previous owner of this land," I continued, tapping the paper again, "allowed access as a courtesy. Verbal agreement. No recorded easement. No legal right-of-way." I looked up, meeting Diane's eyes directly now. "Which means the moment I bought this parcel last year, that access became mine." The words landed heavy. You could hear it in the way the crowd went quiet, the horns dying off one by one as drivers stepped out of their vehicles, trying to understand what they were hearing. A man near the front shook his head slowly, like he was replaying every time he had driven down that road without thinking twice about it. A woman pulled out her phone, probably checking bookings, cancellations, money slipping through her fingers by the minute. Diane took another step forward, close enough now that I could smell her perfume mixing with the lake air, sharp and expensive, but not strong enough to cover the tension. "You are saying you own the only access point to 47 properties," she said, her voice lower now, more controlled again, but there was something underneath it, not confidence, calculation. "I am saying," I replied, That every car sitting back there, every guest trying to check in, every boat that is supposed to launch this weekend, all of it depends on a road that runs across my land. I let my gaze drift past her again, taking in the line of vehicles, the restless movement, the rising heat off the asphalt. And right now, I added, that road is closed. The chain on the gate shifted slightly in the breeze, metal brushing against metal with a soft, steady scrape that somehow sounded louder now that everything else had gone quiet. Diane followed the sound for just a second, then looked back at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not have a quick answer ready. That was when I knew I had her. Not because I raised my voice, not because I threatened anything, but because the one thing she had always counted on, control, was sitting on the other side of a lock she did not own. The silence did not last long because silence like that never does when money is involved, and you could almost feel the moment it snapped, voices rising behind Diane as people started asking questions all at once. Not politely either, sharp and direct, the kind of tone people use when something they paid for suddenly feels uncertain. A man in a blue shirt stepped forward first, keys still in his hand. What do you mean closed? We rented for the weekend. And another voice cut in right after. I have a boat launch scheduled in an hour. And then another. We already paid in full. The words stacked on top of each other until the air itself felt crowded, heavy with frustration and heat. And through all of it Diane stayed facing me. But I could see it now, that tight control she always carried was starting to crack at the edges. Not loudly, not dramatically, just small things, the way her shoulders were no longer perfectly square, the way her fingers tightened around her phone just a little too hard, like she was calculating faster than she could respond, trying to regain ground that was already gone. Everyone just give us a moment, she said over her shoulder, lifting a hand without turning around, still trying to manage the crowd like she always had. But this time they did not settle as quickly. A few did. But others kept talking, low conversations spreading through the line of cars, people checking emails, scrolling bookings, doing the math in real time, lost weekends, refunds, reputations, all of it adding up faster than anyone wanted to admit, and I just stood there letting it happen because this part mattered, not the argument, not the words, but the realization, the moment they understood that access was not guaranteed, that it had always depended on something they never questioned, something they never even saw. I picked up the papers again and folded them carefully, slow, deliberate, like I had all the time in the world, because now I did. Diane finally stepped closer, lowering her voice enough that only I could hear her. But there was no softness left in it now, just tension wrapped in control. This is not how disputes are handled, she said, each word measured precise, like she was reading from a script she had used 100 times before. You cannot just shut down access to an entire community over an invoice. I met her eyes steady, not raising my voice, not matching her tension, just holding the line. You shut down my payment over a technicality, I said. This is just the same logic applied somewhere else. Her jaw tightened again, and for a second I thought she might push harder, escalate it, call someone, threaten something bigger, but she did not yet, because she was still trying to find the angle that gave her control back, and that was when the memory of that email hit me again, clear as the moment I opened it. Sitting at my kitchen table late at night, the glow of the screen reflecting off the wood, the smell of coffee gone cold, reading the words over and over, unapproved work, no contractual obligation. HOA is not responsible. Each sentence clean, detached, like the work had not happened, like the nights, the crews, the materials, none of it existed, and I remember leaning back in my chair, staring at that screen, feeling that slow shift inside, not anger, not yet, something quieter, sharper, the kind of feeling that tells you the rules just changed. And if you keep playing the same way, you are the one who loses. That was the moment I stopped thinking like a contractor and started thinking like an owner, because that is what this really was, not just a bill, not just a disagreement, but a line, and they crossed it first. Diane exhaled slowly, almost imperceptible, then straightened just a little, like she had made a decision. Open the gate, she said, no softness, no request, just expectation. Like the authority she was used to still applied here. I glanced at the lock, the chain pulled tight, the sunlight hitting the metal just right, and then back at her. Not yet, I said, simple, calm, final, the kind of answer that does not leave room for negotiation, and behind her the voices kept building, louder now, more urgent, because people were starting to understand exactly what was at stake, not later, not in some abstract way, but right now, in the heat, in the line of cars, in the bookings that were slipping minute by minute. And Diane knew it too. I could see it in the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the crowd, then back to me, recalculating, adjusting, because for the first time since this started, she was not deciding what happened next, she was reacting to it, and that was something she was not used to. The heat kept building, not just from the sun but from the pressure of too many people realizing at the same time that something they thought was guaranteed was suddenly negotiable. And that is a dangerous place for any situation to land, especially when money and expectations are tied together. I could hear snippets of conversation drifting through the air. They cannot do this? Call someone? This has to be illegal? And that word right there always shows up eventually, illegal, like it is a magic switch that fixes everything. But most people do not actually know what is legal. They just know what they are used to, and those two things are not always the same. Diane took a slow breath and stepped even closer, lowering her voice again, trying one more time to pull this back into a space she understood. "You are making a mistake," she said, and there it was, not a threat, not yet, but close enough to feel like one. I tilted my head slightly, watching her, measuring the shift in her tone. "No," I said calmly. The mistake was thinking I would just let that invoice disappear. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, and for the first time since this started, she glanced away from me for longer than a second, scanning the line of people behind her, the growing tension, the questions she could not answer fast enough, and that was when the situation started to turn in a way she could not control, because now it was not just me versus her. Now it was her versus them. A man near the front stepped forward, not aggressive but firm, the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you paid for something and expect it to be there. "Ma'am, we need to get through," he said, direct, respectful, but not willing to wait forever. Diane turned toward him, slipping back into her public voice, the one she used at meetings and emails, smooth and measured. "We are resolving a temporary access issue," she said. "Please remain patient." But patience has a shelf life, and you could feel it running out. People shifted, checked their watches, looked at their phones, calculating time, reservations, refunds, and that low hum of frustration turned sharper, more focused, because now they had someone to aim it at, and it was not me. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed, breathing steady, because this part was predictable. This was always how it played out when control slipped. It does not vanish all at once, it transfers, and right now it was moving away from Diane and toward the situation itself, something she could not negotiate with, something she could not talk down. The gate stood there, silent and unmoving, and that silence was louder than anything she could say. She turned back to me, voice tighter now. "What do you want?" she asked, and that question mattered, not because I did not already know the answer, but because she finally asked it, not as an assumption, not as a dismissal, but as a real question. I let a second pass, just enough to make it clear I was not rushing this. Then I spoke. "You already have it?" I said, tapping the folded papers lightly against my palm. "An invoice, detailed, itemized, delivered on time." Her expression hardened again, trying to regain footing. "That invoice is disputed," she said, but the words did not carry the same weight they had in that email. Not here. Not with all these people listening. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "You refused it, there is a difference." And I could see it land. Not just with her but with the people behind her, that distinction, simple but important, because refusing something is a choice, and choices have consequences. The air felt thicker now, the smell of warm asphalt mixing with lake water, engines still idling, some drivers turning them off now, conserving fuel, settling in like they might be here a while. Diane shifted her weight, adjusting, recalculating again. "We can review this with the board," she said. "Set a meeting, go through proper channels." I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I expected. Delay, process, time, tools that work when you control the timeline. But she did not control it anymore. I looked past her again at the line of cars, the restless movement, the growing impatience, then back at her. "You can review it all you want," I said evenly. "But until it is paid, nothing changes." Her jaw tightened again, and for a second neither of us spoke, just stood there in the heat, the sound of the lake behind us, the weight of the situation settling into something solid, something real, and that was when someone from the back shouted, louder than the rest, frustration breaking through. "Are we getting in or not?" The question cut through everything, sharp and direct, and Diane turned slightly, caught between answering them and dealing with me. And in that moment it was clear, she could not do both because the answer to them depended on me, And that was the part she never saw coming. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, bouncing between the cars, the people, the lake, like nobody wanted to be the one to answer it out loud. Because once it was answered, everything else would follow. Diane turned halfway toward the voice, just enough to acknowledge it without committing to anything, and I watched her carefully, because this was the part where people either double down or adjust, and you could see the decision forming in real time, the slight shift in her stance, the way she squared her shoulders again, pulling herself back together piece by piece. "We are working on it," she called out, louder now, projecting confidence she did not fully have. "Please remain where you are." But the words did not land the same anymore, not after everything that had already been said. People exchanged looks, some nodded reluctantly, others did not, and a few stepped out of line entirely, walking closer, trying to get a better view of the gate, of me, of her, of whatever this situation was turning into. I could hear a car engine shut off near the front, then another, the steady hum fading into something quieter, more focused, like the whole place was holding its breath. Diane turned back to me, her voice dropping again, tighter now, more urgent. "This is getting out of hand?" she said, and I could not help the small shake of my head, not dismissive, just factual. "No," I replied, "this is exactly where it was always going." Her eyes locked onto mine, searching, measuring, trying to find an opening, some angle she had not used yet. "You are hurting your own position," she said. "This kind of move will not hold up." I let that sit for a second, then reached into the truck again and pulled out a second document. This one newer, cleaner, the paper still stiff from the printer. "I thought about that," I said, unfolding it slowly, before I did any of this. I handed it toward her, not forcing it, just offering it, and after a brief hesitation, she took it, eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping altogether, and that was when I saw it. Not panic, not yet, but recognition. The kind that hits when you realize the other person did more homework than you expected. "Temporary access restriction notice," she read quietly, more to herself than to me, the words heavy in her mouth, legal, precise, filed and stamped. I watched her process it, the way her posture shifted again, this time not outward, not for the crowd, but inward, recalculating in a way she could not show. "Filed with the county this morning," I added, keeping my tone even, "along with a formal notice of suspended access due to unresolved financial dispute tied to property maintenance." She looked up at me, eyes sharper now. "You are escalating this," she said, and I gave a small nod. "No," I said. "I am formalizing it." The difference mattered, and she knew it because escalation sounds emotional, reactive, something you can argue against, but formalization, that is structure, that is process, that is something you have to deal with, not dismiss. Behind her, the crowd had gone quieter again, not because they were calm, but because they were listening, really listening, catching pieces of the conversation, understanding enough to know this was not a simple delay, this was a legal situation, and that changes everything. Diane glanced back at them, then at the paper again, then back at me. "This will take time," she said, and there it was again, the same strategy, stretch it out, push it forward by space, but I had already accounted for that. "It already has," I replied, 3 weeks of it." I gestured toward the lake, toward the docks, the walls, the work that stood there solid and finished. "You used every hour of that time." Her grip tightened on the paper just slightly, enough to notice if you were looking for it, and I was, because details matter, always have, always will. "We can arrange a partial payment," she said after a moment, testing the waters, trying to find a middle ground she could control. I did not answer right away, just watched her, then glanced past her again at the line of people, the closed gate, the still water beyond it. "Full," I said finally, simple, clear, no room for interpretation. Her lips pressed together, and for a second she said nothing, just stood there with the paper in her hand, the crowd behind her waiting, the situation pressing in from every side, and I could see it now, the moment where she understood that this was no longer about winning, it was about minimizing loss, and that is a very different kind of decision, one she was not used to making in front of an audience like this. The breeze picked up slightly, just enough to move the chain on the gate again, metal brushing softly against metal, steady, unchanging, and I rested my hand lightly on the hood of my truck, feeling the warmth of the sun-soaked metal, grounded, steady, because everything that needed to be set in motion already was, and now all that was left was to see how long she would take to accept it. The shift happened slowly, the kind of shift you only notice if you are paying attention, because it does not come with noise or movement, it comes with silence, with people stopping mid-sentence, with heads turning not toward the gate but toward Diane, waiting, expecting, and that is when the pressure changes direction, because up until now it had been me standing alone against her authority. But now it was her standing between me and everyone else, and that is a much harder place to hold. She looked down at the paper again, then back up at me, then over her shoulder at the crowd, and I could see the calculation running faster now, not about rules or process, but about consequences. Real ones, immediate ones, the kind that do not wait for a board meeting or a follow-up email. A man near the front stepped forward again, closer this time, his voice firmer. "Ma'am, we have been waiting over 30 minutes, and someone else added, we are losing bookings right now." And another voice, from further back, louder, more frustrated. "This is on the HOA, right?" And that question hit harder than the rest because it was not about access anymore, it was about responsibility, and Diane knew it. Her posture shifted again, not collapsing, not giving in, but adjusting, turning slightly to face them more fully now, no longer able to keep this contained between the two of us. "We are addressing it," she said, but the confidence in her voice was thinner now, stretched, like it was running out of room to hold everything together. I watched her carefully, not interrupting, not pushing, just letting the moment build, because pressure works best when you do not rush it. She turned back to me again, closer than before, her voice low enough that only I could hear it. "If I authorize payment right now," she said, choosing each word carefully, "you open the gate immediately." It was not a question, not quite, more like a test, a way to see if there was still room to negotiate something on her terms. I did not answer right away, just looked at her, then at the paper in her hand, then past her to the line of cars, the restless movement, the heat rising off the pavement, in soft waves, and I let that image settle between us, because that was the reality she had to account for. Not just me, not just the invoice, but everything stacked behind it. "Payment clears," I said finally. "Gate opens." Simple, direct, no extra language, no room for interpretation. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "You expect immediate confirmation," she said, and I gave a small nod. "Same-day wire certified?" I replied. "You know how this works." Because she did. She had approved plenty of payments before, just not this one. Not until now. She exhaled slowly, a controlled release, then stepped back half a pace, creating just enough distance to shift into a different role, the public one again. But this time with less certainty behind it, she turned toward the crowd, lifting her voice so they could hear. "We are resolving the issue," she said, and there was a subtle change in how it sounded, less authority, more urgency. "Please remain where you are." Few people nodded, others did not, but the noise softened slightly, not because they were satisfied, but because they sensed movement, progress, something happening, and that is often enough to buy a little time. She pulled out her phone, tapping quickly, dialing, waiting, her free hand resting against her side, fingers flexing once, then stilling. I could hear the faint ring through the speaker, then a voice on the other end, muffled, professional. She turned slightly away, speaking in low, clipped sentences. "Yes, this is Diane Whitmore. I need a wire initiated immediately. Full amount. No, not scheduled now." She paused, listening, her posture tightening again. "I am aware of the procedures, I need it done anyway." Another pause, longer this time, and I could see the tension in the line of her shoulders, the way her weight shifted subtly from one foot to the other, like she was holding herself in place while everything else moved around her. The crowd watched, quieter now, focused on her, on the phone, on whatever decision was being made on the other end of that call, because now it mattered to all of them, not just me, not just her, but every person waiting behind that gate. After a few more seconds she ended the call, lowering the phone slowly, then looked back at me, her expression controlled again, but different, less certain, more measured. "It is being processed," she said, and there it was, not a victory, not yet, but a shift, a real one, the first concrete step toward resolution. I nodded once, not smiling, not reacting beyond that, because this was not about emotion, it was about completion, and until that wire hit, nothing changed. The chain on the gate moved again in the breeze, soft, steady. The same sound it had been making all morning, and I rested my hand back on the hood of my truck, feeling the warmth under my palm, grounded, patient, because I knew something she was just now learning. Control is not about who speaks the loudest. It is about who holds the last step, and right now, that step was still mine. Time stretched in a strange way after that. Not slow and not fast, just heavy, like every second had weight to it. The kind you could feel pressing down through the heat, through the quiet murmur of the crowd, through the steady presence of that locked gate standing between expectation and reality. Diane did not move much after the call, just stood there with her phone in hand, eyes occasionally flicking to the screen, then back to me, then past me to the lake like she was trying to will the situation into resolving itself faster. But systems do not move faster just because someone important is waiting, and that is something people like her rarely have to deal with. The man in the blue shirt checked his watch again, then looked toward Diane, then at me, then back at the gate, the pattern repeating like he was trying to make sense of a loop that should not exist. A woman near the second row of cars opened her door and stepped out, the sound of it cutting clean through the quiet. She leaned against the roof, phone pressed to her ear, voice low but urgent, probably explaining to someone on the other end why they were not getting into a lake house they already paid for. And behind her a couple started unloading a cooler from the back of their SUV, not because they were settling in, but because waiting without doing something felt worse. The smell of sunscreen drifted faintly through the air now, mixing with asphalt and lake water, a strange combination that only happens in places like this where leisure meets inconvenience. I stayed where I was, not pacing, not checking my own phone, just watching, because this part is where most people lose their position. They get impatient, they talk too much, they try to push, but pushing too early weakens the leverage, and I was not about to do that. The chain on the gate shifted again in the breeze, that soft metal on metal sound steady and unchanged, almost like a metronome marking time. Diane's phone buzzed once in her hand, sharp and immediate, and everything around us seemed to tighten just a little. She glanced down, eyes scanning quickly. Then she froze for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but it was there, that moment where confirmation hits before words do. She looked back up at me, expression controlled again, but different now, not searching, not calculating, just acknowledging something that had already happened. She stepped forward, closing the space between us again. "The wire is confirmed," she said, voice steady, professional, but stripped of the edge it had earlier. I did not respond right away, just reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up in the sunlight. I opened the banking app, fingers moving without hesitation, because I already knew what I was looking for, and there it was, clean, simple, unmistakable, $63,500, incoming, timestamp just seconds ago. I let the screen sit there for a moment, letting the confirmation settle in fully, not just for me, but for her too. Then I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket, the movement slow, deliberate, final, the kind of motion that signals a transition, not a negotiation. I turned toward the gate, feeling every set of eyes shift with me. The entire line of people now focused on one simple action, one outcome, one decision that had been building since the moment this started. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked the few steps forward, the sound sharp in the quiet. I reached for the chain, fingers wrapping around the metal, warm from the sun, solid, real, and for a brief second I paused, not for effect, not for drama, just to register the moment, because moments like this do not come often. The point where everything lines up exactly as it should, where the work, the patience, the planning all meet in one simple action. I lifted the lock, the weight of it familiar in my hand, turned the key, and felt that clean mechanical click, precise, undeniable, the kind of sound that does not need explanation. I pulled the chain free, letting it fall against the gate with a dull metallic drop, then pushed the gate open, slow at first, then wider, the hinges groaning softly as they moved for the first time that morning, and just like that, the barrier that had held everything in place was gone. A ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, not chaotic, but immediate, doors closing, engines starting, people moving back into their vehicles with a renewed sense of purpose. Diane stepped aside without a word, giving the space she had been trying to control all morning back to the people who needed it, and I walked back toward my truck, not rushing, not looking back, because I did not need to. The sound of tires rolling over gravel filled the air behind me. Steady, continuous, the flow returning, access restored, and as I reached the driver's door, I paused for just a second, hand resting on the handle, feeling the warmth of the metal under the sun, grounded again, because the truth was simple. It was never about the gate. It was about the line they thought they could ignore, and the moment they learned they could not. The first few cars rolled through slow, cautious at first, like they did not fully trust that the situation had actually changed. Tires crunching over gravel, windows still half down. eyes flicking between me and Diane like they were making sure there was no second gate waiting somewhere ahead. But once the first vehicle cleared the entrance and kept going, something shifted again, not tension this time, but release, the kind that moves fast, engines revving a little higher, doors shutting with more confidence, people settling back into plans that had only been paused, not canceled. And within minutes the line that had stretched down the road started to collapse forward, steady and controlled, like a system snapping back into place after being forced to stop. I stood there for a moment longer, watching it happen, the rhythm of movement returning, the lake pulling people back the way it always did, calm on the surface, valuable underneath, and I could hear bits of conversation as they passed, quick comments through open windows. About time. What a mess. They better fix this. None of it directed at me, not really, because by now they understood what had happened, maybe not every detail, but enough to know that the gate had not been the problem, it had been the response or the lack of one. Diane stayed off to the side, no longer in the center of anything, her phone still in her hand but unused now, her attention shifting from me to the flow of cars, tracking, measuring, adjusting to a situation she no longer controlled. And that was the part that lingered longer than anything else. Not the payment, not the gate, but that shift. I opened my truck door but did not get in right away, just rested my arm on the frame, looking out over the road as it cleared, the last few vehicles making their way through, the sound of engines fading as they moved closer to the water, and the quiet that followed felt different from before, lighter, less strained, like something had been resolved even if nobody said it out loud. Diane finally walked over, slower this time, no rush, no sharp edges left in her movement, just controlled, measured steps that stopped a few feet away from me, close enough to talk, not close enough to pretend anything had gone the way she planned. "You made your point?" she said, voice even, but without the authority it carried earlier. I glanced at her briefly, then back at the now open road. "It was never about a point," I said. "It was about a balance." She nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging. And for a moment neither of us said anything, the lake breeze moving through the trees, carrying that same mix of water and wood and summer air. Steady, unchanged. "This will be addressed at the next board meeting," she added after a second, slipping back into the structure she knew, the system she trusted, and I gave a small nod because that was fine, that was her world. But this morning had not been. "Make sure it is?" I said, simple, not a warning, just a fact, because if there was one thing this situation made clear, it was that assumptions do not hold up when they are tested. She held my gaze for a second longer, then turned and walked back toward the road, already shifting into whatever came next for her. Damage control, explanations, maybe even revisions to how things were handled going forward. But that was not my concern anymore. I climbed into the truck, the seat warm from the sun, the familiar smell of dust and metal grounding me again. I started the engine and let it idle for a moment, listening to the steady hum, the same sound that had filled the air earlier. But now it felt different, quieter somehow, more contained. I glanced. Once more at the gate, standing open, chain hanging loose against the post, the lock resting where I left it, simple, solid, nothing special, and that was the point, it never needed to be. I pulled the door closed and shifted into drive, easing the truck forward onto the road, not toward the lake, but away from it, because my